Neil Asher Silberman's The Hidden Scrolls, Christianity, Judaism, and the War for the Dead Sea Scrolls. Chapter 6, Sons of Light, Sons of Darkness. From his office in a turn-of-the-century brownstone building on the south side of Washington Square Park in Greenwich Village, Professor Lawrence Schiffman of the New York University has become a major player in the world of the Dead Sea Scrolls. As a scholar, he is one of the leaders in the study of Qumran literature from a rabbinic perspective, utilizing his knowledge of Talmudic sources to provide a deeper and richer context for the legalistic faith of the scrolls. As an Orthodox Jew, he is unashamedly joyfully observant, finding an obvious personal connection to the halakhic debates and messianic expectation of these ancient Jewish texts. Now in his late 40s, Schiffman is immediately recognizable at academic conferences. Lanky, animated, and in contrast to the terminal tweediness of most university professors, he wears a full beard, a black skullcap, and a dark, sedate suit. But Schiffman is certainly not a sedate personality. He delights in spicing his conversations with rabbinic parables, colorful Catskill jokes, and good-hearted self-deprecation. And in recent years, he has become a much sought-after speaker for religious and academic groups all over the country, who appreciate his message about the importance of the Dead Sea Scrolls for understanding the history of Judaism. For Schiffman, the group that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls does not represent an evolutionary stage of religious development or an inspiring example of national resistance, but a disturbing example of religious pathology. Despite his obvious professional fascination, Larry Schiffman has no romantic illusions about the obsessive, rigidly dogmatic nature of the Dead Sea sect. Though there are many purity concerns and biblical interpretations shared by the Qumran literature and the rabbinic tradition, Schiffman believes that the feverish visions of sons of light, battling sons of darkness, of the presence of angels in the council of the community, and the imminent arrival of the Messiah are all the result of the dangerous radicalization of priestly purists, not signs of spiritual enlightenment. More than 20 years ago, when Schiffman was a graduate student in Judaic studies at Brandeis University, he began his involvement with the scrolls as a complete outsider. In those days, Qumran literature was not something you studied on a doctoral level unless you had access to the vast collection of unpublished Cave 4 manuscripts. And the cruel fact of the matter was that if you were not a student of Frank Cross, John Strugnell, or any other international team member, there was no realistic possibility of access. Back in the days when the international team had gone into a form of suspended animation, Strugnell, Cross, Skehan, and Starkey began to treat their allotments of Cave 4 text as private intellectual property, regularly using photographs of unpublished texts as teaching materials in advanced seminars, and on occasion bestowing them as prestigious dissertation topics to their most cherished scholarly protégés. Although Schiffman lived and studied at Brandeis University in Waltham, only a few miles away from the Harvard campus in Cambridge, he might have lived on another planet as far as the Dead Sea Scrolls was concerned. All that he really knew of the Qumran community's sectarian literature were the texts that had been published: the Damascus document, the community rule, the war scroll, the Thanksgiving hymns, the Habakkuk commentary, and the other documents that had trickled out into the scholarly literature since the mid-1950s, or were contained in the first 5 volumes of the Discoveries in the Judean Desert series. When Yagil Yadin came to the United States for a sabbatical in the 1969-70 academic year to lecture on the Temple Scroll with its complex law codes about Jerusalem, the Temple, and the ideal king of Israel, Schiffman decided to write a doctoral dissertation about the role and function of ritual law at Qumran. He remembers how his faculty advisors tried their best to dissuade him from wasting his time with such fragmentary material. They told me, "You can make a much better mark, you're much better off with substantive scholarship, and not this puzzle-putting together stuff." Schiffman persisted. He has never lacked energy and enthusiasm in his studies. His Ph.D. dissertation, published in 1975 as The Halakha at Qumran, is not what you might consider poolside reading, but it made an important contribution in examining Qumran purity laws, festival observances, and ritual regulations, and their striking similarities in form, if not in content, to the later rabbinic discussion and codification of Jewish religious law. There was in the Qumran literature, he believed, clear evidence that Talmudic-style legal debate had already emerged in the days of the Temple, not just in the aftermath of its destruction, when a new kind of Jewish devotion was required. Yet few serious scholars of Rabbinic Judaism seemed to pay any attention. "I realized that I had to convince people of the importance of this," Schiffman told me, "because I would go to a conference and there would be 7 people talking about the Mishnah, and they didn't know anything about these texts. I'd get up and talk about the laws of Shabbat at Qumran, and nobody cared." A year after the now famous 1984 conference in Jerusalem, when MMT was presented for the first time to the scholarly public, Schiffman was one of the organizers of the Dead Sea Scrolls Conference at NYU. That proved to be the next landmark along the road to open rebellion against the power of the international team. That is only evident in retrospect, however, for the assembled scholars were then quite respectful and grateful to be given a detailed briefing by John Strugnell himself about various interesting texts on which the international team members and their assistants were now working, and how the vast majority of the K4 materials would soon become generally available. "The atmosphere was very nice, very pleasant," Schiffman remembered. "John gave his report on where things stood at that time, which everybody believed like suckers. That's the other thing. We always believed that it was coming out next year. You know, it's like the Mishnah. It's like the Messiah. There's a story about someone who sees 2 signs in the mountains going up to the Catskills. One says, 'Come to the new Grossinger's opening soon,' and the other says, 'The Mashiach's on the way.' So that person says, 'I see. When Grossinger's finally opens, the Mashiach will come.' It was the same thing at the conference," Schiffman recalled in amazement at his own naivety. "He said it, and we believed it." Yet in the years that followed the 1985 NYU conference, Larry Schiffman slowly began to be accepted into the leadership of a new generation of scroll scholars. Since he was increasingly recognized even among members of the international team as a specialist in Qumran's rabbinic connections, he was eventually asked to offer his opinion on the still-secret 120-line text of MMT. The level of secrecy was stringent. On a summer research trip to Israel, he spent several weeks reading the commentary that Strugnell and Qumran had prepared with the help of Professor Yaakov Sussman of the Hebrew University. Strugnell, Qumran, and Sussman had all recognized some of the striking connections between the Temple Scroll and MMT. In both, the authority was Scripture, the one-time revelation by God to Moses on Mount Sinai, as expressed in the Torah. Whether the issue was one of royal polygamy, temple architecture, or the acceptability of Gentile offerings, the authors of MMT and the Temple Scroll arrived at their positions through a careful study of the law. And even though Strugnell, Qumran, and Sussman were convinced that MMT was written by the teacher of righteousness, Yadin had believed that the Temple Scroll was also his composition, in brackets. Schiffman found that the tone of MMT was far too mild-mannered and level-headed to have been written by the teacher. It contained no hint of the sudden, stunning divine revelations, newly revealed apocalyptic secrets, or ancient mysteries now made clear only to the initiated members of the community, that characterized the intense sectarian frame of mind of the War Scroll, the Thanksgiving hymns, the Damascus document, and the community rule. Those documents starkly separated the world into light and darkness. They commanded the members of the sect, the Sons of Zadok, to love their brothers and to cut off all contact with God's enemies. In the Qumran sect's fully developed apocalyptic vision, the lots of light and darkness had been determined by God at the creation, and events on earth paralleling the struggles in heaven between the forces of light and darkness were moving inevitably, inexorably toward their cataclysmic end. In the Thanksgiving hymns, the author, the teacher of righteousness, in brackets, with a question mark, offered his praise to God for selecting him to be a vessel of revelation through which he could communicate news of the coming day of judgment to the elect of Israel. This was a very different conception of divine revelation. It was one that did not end at Mount Sinai, but continued in times of crisis to the author's own day. It was as if MMT and the Temple Scroll were written by a completely different group of people. And although the traditional tendency in Qumran studies was to treat ancient texts like the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes as archetypal groupings that could be rearranged and move around like chessmen in varying historical perspectives, Schiffman did not try to reconcile the polite argumentation of MMT with the apocalyptic rage of the other documents. He saw in the contrast between them potent evidence for the internal history and increasing radicalization of the sect. In a way, the Damascus document, the first of the Qumran text to be discovered, told the story of the early days of the sect in poetic language. It related that in the age of wrath, 390 years after the destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, God, and here's the quote, visited them, and he caused a plant root to spring from Aaron, and Israel to inherit his land and to prosper on the good things of his earth. And they perceived their iniquity and recognized that they were guilty men. Yet for 20 years they were blind men groping for the way. End of quote. This is precisely the period Schiffman believes that MMT was written, when a dissident group within the Jerusalem priesthood took serious objection to the way that certain cultic practices were observed. The figure of 390 years after the exile, in brackets, which would date the sect's moment of first inspiration to 196 BCE, end of bracket, has been seen by many scholars as a purely symbolic figure, echoing the prophet Ezekiel oracle of 390 days of penance that must be suffered by the righteous remnant of Israel. Yet, whatever the date, the initial period was apparently one of religious uncertainty for a particularly conservative priestly group. They don't start with violent fantasies, Schiffman explained. They start very calm. They write a letter apparently and say, look, we don't agree with this, and you should know that if you don't repent, you're going to suffer in the way our previous kings did. But when you follow Torah, everything is fine. But the problem was, according to Schiffman, that this mild-mannered and well-reasoned appeal by the priestly group that considered themselves the true heirs of the Zadokite priesthood simply did not work. Instead, the Damascus document went on to describe the rise of a leader after the first 20 years of spiritual unease and uncertainty among the sons of Zadok. Here's the quote. And God observed their deeds, and they sought him with a whole heart, and he raised for them a teacher of righteousness to guide them in the way of his heart. And he made known to the later generations that which God had done to the later generation, the congregation of traitors who had departed from the way. End of quote. This is the point at which Schiffman believes the group is transformed from a movement of priestly protest into a radicalized isolationist sect. From that time forth, legal argumentation began to take a backseat to direct divine communications, and the revelations accorded to the teacher became central to the theology of the sect. God-sent inspiration, not just earnest study, became the key to understanding the deeper meaning of the scriptures that the group came to identify as mysteries and hidden law, and drawing on a rich tradition of apocalyptic speculation, this group envisioned itself as the head of the worldly forces of light at a turning point in the history of creation. They lived in the company of angels and required of themselves the highest standards of purity. And that is the reason for the difference between MMT, the Temple Scroll, and the specifically sectarian documents according to Schiffman. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, we can gain a unique glimpse at the genesis of what the news magazines and TV tabloid shows might call a cult, if such a group arose today. But what happens when a cult's teaching appeals to a far wider public than the inner circle of fervent believers who are willing to leave their hometowns, jobs, and families to follow the way into the wilderness that leads to oblivion at places like Waco or Jonestown? The process Schiffman described was one of the dangerous radicalization of alienated believers who failed at persuading their co-religionists that their vision of the world was identical to God's. Yet there is some evidence in Josephus's histories that teachings very similar to those contained in the Qumran literature spurred ever wider segments of the Judean population to action during the 1st century CE. Though occasional dissenters and rivals are mentioned in Josephus's account of King Herod's reign, the violent attempt, while Herod lay on his deathbed, by some religious purists to tear down the golden eagle that adorned the main gate to the temple, and the widespread outbreaks of messianic enthusiasm and even open rebellion in the reign of Archelaus, transformed the calm discussion of legal matters into the lightning bolt recognition by many that the messianic era had actually arrived. There were undoubtedly those who ceased regarding the present as politics as usual and began to see even everyday events as the fulfillment of a divine plan for history. While the public was undoubtedly listening to many different groups, each with their own teachers and their own standards of righteousness, the extent to which the general phenomenon was spreading as a conscious movement is betrayed by Josephus himself. By the time of Pontius Pilate, 26 to 36 CE, who was more energetic than his predecessors in trying to make Judea a normal province, the religious protest of individual zealots began to give way to religious demonstrations by the population at large. The issues at stake in the time of Pilate were his confiscation of funds from the temple treasury and his order that his troops, gilded battle standards bearing the image of Emperor Tiberius, be set up in the fortress overlooking the temple. Both acts aggravated the already sensitive issues of the purity of the holy city and the inviolability of the temple that had been the main concern of the authors of MMT and the Temple Scroll. There was no question that the sudden public response to Pontius Pilate's actions was remembered for decades. In Josephus's earliest works, The Jewish War, the incident of the standards is the first time that resistance to a Roman governor's action is ascribed to the populace, in general, not to a particular sect. According to his description of the events, Pilate ordered that the standards be brought into Jerusalem and set up under cover of darkness. On the next morning, a mass protest erupted with a large multitude of both city and country people making their way to the port city of Caesarea, where Pilate maintained his official residence. In earlier times, during the reign of Herod, individual zealots would rise up to take action against violations of the sanctity of the temple, as in the case of Herod's golden eagle, but this was a far more serious threat. From Pilate's standpoint, this was merely a matter of exercising legitimate Roman power. The battle standards, to which Roman troops offered sacrifices to the goddesses of victory and fortune, were the symbols of the empire's prestige. To allow a mob to prevent the troops' free movement anywhere in the empire would be to surrender to lawlessness. But to the Judeans, Pilate's act was an insult, a double cross of the Judeans' sufferance of Roman rule, permissible as long as at least lip service was paid to their religious autonomy. But now, with Tiberius's grim-faced head being pried to and sacrificed to within a stone's throw of the inner court of the temple, there was no longer even a charade of respectfulness. And for someone like the author of the Qumran commentary on Habakkuk, the issue of the standards in Jerusalem was not just a religious misunderstanding to be solved by negotiation, but was one of the God-given signs that conclusively identified the Romans as the Kittim, the sons of darkness. For according to their interpretation of the ancient oracle, they would be a brutal people who sacrificed to their standards and worshiped their weapons of war. Massing outside Pilate's residence, the protesters refused to disperse when the governor rejected their demand that he removed the graven images from the holy city at once. Finally, Pilate summoned them to the city's amphitheater on the pretext that he was willing to talk. According to Josephus, he ordered his soldiers to surround the protesters in the arena, and after threatening to cut them down if they refused to admit Caesar's images, signaled to the soldiers to draw their swords. Thereupon the Jews, as concerted action, flung themselves in a body on the ground, extended their necks, and exclaimed that they were ready rather to die than transgress the law. Overcome with astonishment at such religious zeal, Pilate gave orders for the immediate removal of the standards from Jerusalem. These people were willing to give up their lives for the law, because by the 1st century, many Judeans had come to believe that while the fate after death of most people was uncertain, the righteous dead would surely be brought to life again on Judgment Day. This powerful belief in the immortality of any Jews who willingly chose to be religious martyrs seems first to have arisen in the wars and religious revivals of the Maccabean period. The prophet Daniel's promise of everlasting life for the righteous who sleep in the dust, and the ideal of sacred martyrdom expressed again and again in the books of the Maccabees, seems to have been especially useful at times when heavy casualties were suffered by the soldiers and border settlers of the expanding Hasmonean state. More victims and martyrs were to be created in the 10-year term of Pilate. After he confiscated funds from the temple to fund an ambitious public works project, he slipped plainclothes thugs armed with cudgels into the crowds who gathered for protest, and according to Josephus, Pilate, from the tribunal, gave the agreed signal. Large numbers of Jews perished, some from the blows which they received, others trodden to death. Here was an activist governor, not one likely to wash his hands of the responsibility to keep order. And it was not at all unlikely that among the thousands of resistors turned martyrs who rose in the time of Pontius Pilate was a charismatic religious leader named Jesus, who was arrested for subversive teaching, put to death by the Romans, and was, like all the other holy warriors and pious victims, assured bodily resurrection from the grave. Though through the country, in fact, the idea of resurrection spread widely and was adopted even by those who lived lives of quiet accommodation. This belief is evidenced in the spread of the curiously elaborate Jewish burial practice around Jerusalem of secondary burial in bone boxes or ossuaries. After a year of entombment and decay of the flesh from the body, in brackets, the deceased bones would be gathered together by family members and placed together in a neat limestone box, often inscribed with the deceased private name. The vast cemetery at Qumran, with its row upon row of identical individual interments, has been seen by some scholars as evidence of similar beliefs in bodily resurrection. But the belief seems to be evident in the Thanksgiving hymns, with its hope of assurance that bodies gnawed by worms may be raised from the dust, in the war scroll that God would raise the fallen, and most explicitly in the text that Emil Puek called the Messianic Apocalypse, in which God's anointed would heal the sick and resurrect the dead. Thus, whether by martyrdom, righteousness, or individual internment, many Judeans began to look longingly to beyond the 1,000-year Reich of the Romans to the time when their current indignities and exploitations would be exchanged for a much better life after death. Needless to say, a prospect like this was particularly attractive. It offered bodily healing of a youthfulness more perfect than that offered by any modern spa or miracle drug, prosperity and happiness for every man, woman, and child who had previously suffered, and offered psychic revenge against bullies and oppressors by imagining their own redemption compared to their enemies' sufferings. The belief was part of what must certainly be understood as a national revulsion against the conditions of its own existence, in which those Judeans who dared to challenge the Romans directly were considered martyrs and saints, whose resurrection was assured, and whose sins were fully forgiven, even if some of them would otherwise be considered malcontents, troublemakers, or common criminals. The Romans were determined to do everything they could to discourage Judean resistance, though they did not understand that strong-arm measures would only mobilize more and more candidates for martyrdom. At the time of the Emperor Caligula's mad attempt to erect a statue of himself in the Jerusalem temple, the whole nation, not just a stadium full of zealots, abandoned their fields and daily routines for several weeks of continuous mass protest, vowing to the Roman governor of Syria that if he pressed on with the plan to set up Caligula's image in the temple, he must first sacrifice the entire Jewish nation. Caligula's welcome assassination and replacement by a more reasonable Claudius averted the ultimate confrontation, but only for a while. For the result of the repeated clashes between Roman imperialism and Jewish piety was the radicalization of both. And through the 30s and 40s of the first century, during times of an especially intense drought and economic hardship, and through the short-lived reign of Herod's grandson Agrippa, 40 to 44 CE, more and more of the population became convinced that the Messianic age was nearing and that righteousness expressed by strict observance of the law and by personal resistance to the encroachments of their enemies would earn them a place in the world to come. The many coins and distinctive first-century pottery forms recovered from the Qumran excavations show that this was one of the most active periods in the life of the community. Yet most scroll scholars insist that the community's creative literary period was over. During the days when Pilate raged, Caligula plotted discretion, and drought and famine caused massive economic dislocation. The members of the community, according to the mainline scroll experts, were concerned only with the ritual peccadillos of the long-dead teacher of righteousness and long-dead Hasmonean kings. But there was something more to Judean religious life in the first century than its fragmentation into countless insulated religious sects. A shared national feeling of resistance was mounting, even if leaders' egos and local group allegiances sometimes stood in the way. In that sense, the literature of Qumran reflects the growing radicalization of the nation at the same time that it embodies the developing ideology of the Dead Sea sect. The outbreak of the revolt against Rome in 66 CE would show how widespread this belief was among the people of Judea. There was a vast shared rational treasury of religious poems, oracles, testimonies, and commentaries on the themes of Messiah, holy war, resurrection, and redemption. The members of the Qumran community were avid collectors and apparently authors of this esoteric literature. And if the text's terminology is not always consistent, or their descriptions of the events contradictory, they were not necessarily meant to express a single codified theology. The hundreds of manuscripts recovered from the caves of Qumran are a palimpsest of decades of protest and revolutionary speculation. They were the creative expressions of a shared tradition that projected ancient biblical dreams onto a glorious national future. And there is good reason to believe that the early followers of Jesus were, despite the later anti-Semitic insinuations of church fathers, active participants in the movement as well. Professor Robert Eisenman of California State University at Long Beach speaks with the fervor of a true believer who has been shown a revelation of such stunning splendor that he is driven to preach it, to spread it, and to elaborate upon it at every opportunity, rarely considering the cost to his professional career or to himself. Eisenman's words, his theories, and even his sometimes abrasive personal style have all made a deep impression on me. He is convinced that there is a point to using the evidence of the scrolls as a challenge to, not an illustration of, the conventional historical wisdom. And he is convinced that once his message is given a fair hearing by a wider audience, in brackets, without the ridicule and disdain usually heaped upon it by Qumran insiders, no one will ever think of Qumran, Christianity, or Jesus in quite the same way again. As I have mentioned, I first got to know Eisenman at the stormy 1992 New York Scrolls Conference, and during the months that followed, I began to learn about his theories in a series of lengthy conversations and in a close reading of his two books, Maccabees, Zadokites, Christians, and Qumran, 1983, and James the Just in the Habakkuk Pesher, 1986. These books do not make for easy reading. They are highly technical discussions of Qumran, apocryphal, and New Testament literature in which the footnotes are dense, complex, and extensive. And despite everything the established Qumran scholars continue to say about his books, I found them to be provocative and insightful, offering a radically new approach to understanding not only the Dead Sea Scrolls, but also the early history of Christianity. There may be mistakes and overstatements. Certainly many of Eisenman's proposed connections are based on intuitive leaps rather than on demonstrated textual evidence. And I maintain that they offer an intriguing challenge to conventional wisdom, seeing Qumran not as an isolated, non-political monastery in the wilderness, but as a center of movement of Jewish national resistance to the Roman imperial administration in Judea, and to the self-serving Jewish aristocracy of Jerusalem, who made fortunes for themselves as willing agents of that exploitative regime. What Eisenman suggests is that the original angry gospel of Jewish messianism, expressed clearly in the Qumran literature, is typical of the idealistic, fundamentalist, even revolutionary faith of many first-century Judeans, in spite of the fact that Josephus, the New Testament, and rabbinic literature, each for their own reasons, wanted either to minimize the popularity of this distinctive brand of popular biblical religion, liberation theology you might call it in brackets, or disavow their own participation in it. For Eisenman, the Qumran teacher of righteousness, was not an evolutionary ancestor of Jesus. He and the other apocalyptic teachers of the era were activists in a single powerful movement, unmovably faithful to the idea that the one true God would lead the Jews to victory over the Romans and their despicable Judean collaborators, no matter how incomparably powerful the forces of darkness presently seemed. This, he insists, was the context for the activities not only of the teacher of righteousness, but also of John the Baptist, Jesus and James the Just, the brother of Jesus, who later headed the Council of the Jerusalem Church. All these religious figures, Eisenman explains, were the fomenters among the masses. They were the ayatollahs of their day. They taught among the disenfranchised. They were recognized as saints, sheiks, zaddoks, and holy men. And he insists that all of them were part of a national underground dedicated to the strict observance of the law and the overthrow of Rome. When the Christians call them early Christians, Eisenman points out, we tend to see them as little people walking around with halos around their heads and monks' robes. That's nothing of what they were. Of course, many New Testament scholars and ancient historians have long been interested in the political and social dimensions of Jewish resistance to the Roman Empire. In the most recent developments in the continuing quest for the historical Jesus, which began with the then heretical investigations of the German freethinker Gotthold Ephraim Lessing in the 18th century, and continued with the writings of Ernest Renan in the 19th and Albert Schweitzer in the early 20th centuries. Modern scholars like Richard Horsley and John Dominic Crossan have eloquently sketched out the revolutionary implications of Jesus' teaching as at least partly a political response to the class tensions and relentless Roman imperialism in Judea and Galilee in the 1st century CE. Martin Goodman of Oxford has provided a searing indictment of what he calls the ruling class of Judea, whose homes have been excavated and turned into tourist attractions in Jerusalem's Jewish quarter. And he has placed the blame for the disintegration and ultimate destruction of Jewish independence squarely on them. Yet none of these scholars has recognized the potential of the Dead Sea Scrolls as an important source of reconstructing Judea's political history. All of them take at face value the consensus position that the Qumran sect was entirely marginal to Judean society and cut off from the intense revolutionary agitation in the cities and towns of the country. But it is likely that the walls of Qumran kept out whispers of the horrors and the outrages taking place in former hometowns and villages. Again, but is it likely that the walls of Qumran kept out whispers of the horrors and the outrages taking place in former hometowns and villages? Was the members' inner discipline so unmovable that at least some of them would not turn their apocalyptic speculations towards action? At what point would the leading sages of the community not see that their words could rouse their people to action against the sons of darkness and thereby fulfill the ancient prophecies? The footnotes and endnotes and standard Qumran literature are littered with passing dismissive notices of scholars who have rejected the usual Essene monastery theory and have tried to link the scrolls and the community that wrote or collected them with well-known groups of the 1st century CE. In the 1960s, Cecil Roth and Godfrey Driver insisted that the Dead Sea Scrolls were the literature of the radical zealot faction headed by a charismatic leader named Menachem, son of an earlier rebel, Judah the Galilean. According to Roth and Driver, Menachem was the mysterious teacher of righteousness. There were others like Joel Teicher at Cambridge in the 1950s and Barbara Thiering in Australia in the 1980s, who connected the scrolls and their messianic allusions to early Christianity. In Teicher's view, the teacher of righteousness was none other than Jesus. Thiering preferred John the Baptist for that role, but no one before Robert Eisenman, as far as I am aware, has so decisively closed the equilateral triangle connecting the community at Qumran, the Zealots, and early Christianity. For him, they were all part of the same movement, and the boundaries between them may have been entirely unclear. Their messianic expectations were all firmly fixed on the future, and they posed a different threat not only to the Roman administration of Judea, but to the continuing political ambitions of the Herodian dynasty as well. What is so intriguing about placing the Qumran community and its literature in the 1st century CE, not the 2nd and 1st BCE, is that the main concerns of the sect, the three nets of Belial, designed to ensnare the wicked, namely riches, fornication, and the pollution of the sanctuary, were precisely issues that were the focus of such bitter first-century conflict. There is little evidence beyond pure speculation, as Eisenman points out repeatedly, that the matter of Gentile gifts to the temple or the practice of older men marrying their nieces, part of the charge of fornication, which both the Damascus document and the Temple Scroll condemn, were matters of particular concern in the Hasmonean period. But Josephus's accounts of the events of the first century contain abundant examples of Roman interference with the cult of the teacher, and, even more tellingly, the kinds of uncle-niece marriage condemned in the scrolls were increasingly common among the many Herodian princesses and princelings, jostling each other for power through trysts and other Near Eastern dynasties and strategic marriages among themselves. For the pietists, the religious fundamentalists of the nation who used the Torah, the Temple Scroll, and similar visionary literature to set their standards of behavior, the Herodians were part of the problem, not legitimate national leaders. With the exception of the brief reign of King Agrippa, who was the last royal pretender who could trace his maternal lineage to the Hasmonean dynasty, the Herodian family had been seen by most as more Roman or Idumean than Jewish, and therefore completely disqualified for rule over the people of Israel. But the interest of the Herodian house was not merely to rule Jerusalem and the hilltop towns and villages of Judea. Its more important political interests were to promote integration, commercial or otherwise, between Jews, Idumeans, Ammonites, Moabites, Philistines, and Samaritans, and the more distant people of the Greco-Roman world. At huge cost, Herod the Great had built a glittering kingdom that straddled the boundary between Jew and Gentile. For while he spared no expense in the construction of his stupendous temple in Jerusalem, he also underwrote the construction of impressive pagan temples in Caesarea and Samaria, and as far away as Beirut and Delos. And he saw only doubled, not diminished, honor in serving as the protector of world Jewry, and as the president of the Olympic Games. Could this Herodian political strategy have actually stimulated a trend in theological speculation? Could there have been an ideological reaction to the supporters of the Herodians against the unrelenting attacks of the religious Puritans? Eisenman suggests that after the death of Herod the Great, when the various Herodian princesses and princelings were given or married into scattered petty kingdoms throughout Syria and Asia Minor, a synchronistic new vision of the biblical religion was born that mixed, rather than separated, Jew and Gentile, an ideological admixture that would be a perfect boost for their dynastic fortunes. In one of Eisenman's most daring papers, one that he later proudly recalled, brought an outraged audience walkout at the meeting of the Society of Biblical Literature, where it was delivered. He identified the Apostle Paul as a kinsman of King Agrippa, who saw in the Jewish Messianic movement, and one of its many martyred leaders, the raw material for a very different faith. Eisenman expressed it more directly to me when we talked about the passage in the book of Acts where the former Saul of Tarsus was dispatched by the Herodian appointed high priest to Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, men or women, he may bring them bound to Jerusalem. The way, of course, was a frequently used term in the Qumran literature to describe the community, and it was on the road to execute this manhunt against subversives that Saul was struck blind with his vision of Jesus, thereby becoming a born-again Paul. But was the light from heaven on the road to Damascus a direct revelation or a breathtakingly brilliant transformation of radical Jewish messianism into something quite different? When Paul comes into the movement as a Herodian satrap, lackey, he may even be a visionary, maybe even a sincere person, Eisenman told me. But he's still a Herodian stooge. He comes into the movement, he doesn't know its individuals, but he opposes them and starts getting visionary experiences of an outwardly kind of Christ Jesus in heaven, who is more or less his alter ego, who just reflects his own personal, whom he exteriorizes into an actual supernatural being. And from that moment on becomes Jesus Christ superstar. And that has nothing to do with the historical events in Palestine. We might be inclined to dismiss such a heretical version of the birth of Christianity and its complete mythologization of a person named Jesus, were it not for the fact that there is precious little external corroborating evidence for the version conveyed in the New Testament and the historical works of the Church Fathers. Rabbinic references to Jesus are cryptic and largely polemical. A single paragraph about Jesus in the book 18 of Josephus Flavius's Jewish Antiquities has been heavily edited by Christian scribes and has long been suspected of being entirely contrived. Archaeological evidence is enlightening as background, but largely circumstantial, while excavations have provided much new information on life in Judea and the Galilee in the Hellenistic and Roman periods. Definitive contemporary evidence of only two people who played a significant role in the life of Jesus has ever been found. In 1961, at the ancient port of Caesarea, an Italian team discovered a Latin inscription bearing the name of Pontius Pilate, Praefect of Judea, and in 1990, a staff archaeologist for the Israel Antiquities Authority discovered a tomb in southern Jerusalem used by the family of the notorious high priest Caiaphas. Beyond that, all reconstructions of the life of Jesus are based on later Christian literature and a speculative interpretation of Judean history. Since the beginning of Dead Sea Scroll studies, scholars have been fascinated with the question of the identity of three vivid personalities repeatedly mentioned in the Qumran text: the teacher of righteousness, the wicked priest, and the scoffer, or man of lies. While the vast majority of scholars, as I have said, place these historical figures somewhere in the Hasmonean period, Eisenman sees them as the personifications and the leaders of factions that were in a bitter three-way battle for the hearts and minds of the Judean population in this period: the Messianic movement, the traditional high priesthood, and the Hellenized aristocracy. Eisenman believes that Paul is the man of lies, mentioned with such disdain in the commentary of Habakkuk, who, together with the unfaithful of the New Covenant, have not believed in the covenant of God and have profaned his holy name. In his close line-by-line exegesis of Qumran commentary on Habakkuk, Eisenman suggests that the polemic between the man of lies and the teacher of righteousness centered on the strict observance of all the laws of purity and temple cult. And indeed, he points out the tense confrontation over similar issues in the fateful apostolic And indeed, he points out the tense confrontation over similar issues in the fateful apostolic council held in Jerusalem around 50 CE. At issue was whether Gentile converts to believe in the Messiah needed to undergo circumcision and strictly observe Jewish law. Needless to say, Paul emphasized the centrality of faith in Christ, and James emphasized the necessity that all converts observe at least some of the basic tenets of the law of Moses regarding idolatry, unchastity, and impurity. Elsewhere, for example, in the letter of James, preserved in the New Testament, there is angry condemnation of those who turn their back on the covenant, even in its strictest regulations. For whoever keeps the whole law but fails in one point has become guilty of all of it. These were the kinds of words the teacher of righteousness might have preached in his own council, and indeed Eisenman suggests that even the traditional sobriquet of James the Just substantiates his hypothesis that he was the movement's teacher of righteousness. James was killed in 62 CE on orders of the high priest Ananus, and Eisenman identifies him as the wicked priest of the scrolls. Thus Eisenman has come to believe that Christianity was born as a conscious, intentional, ideological inversion of radical Jewish messianism that occurred only after the death of Jesus, while the Jerusalem community apparently continued to insist on full observance of Jewish ritual and custom. Paul began to lay down the foundations of an entirely different faith. In it, salvation was to be gained not by hating one's oppressors, but by loving them, not by observing the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ. With the revolt and the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 70 CE, the original Jewish messianic movement was gradually wiped out. But Paul's heretical variation continued to spread and gain adherents among the Gentile Christian communities all over the Greco-Roman world. I do not mean to misrepresent the fact that just about every Qumran scholar with whom I have spoken considers Eisenman's theories to be pure nonsense. When I asked Strugnell, he called Eisenman's work totally worthless. Frank Krauss shook his head and would not dignify it with a comment. Listening to one of Eisenman's early lectures, Larry Schiffman recalled that he could not help laughing. Devor Dement of the University of Haifa grew angry when I brought up the subject, and Jonas Greenfield of the Hebrew University has publicly branded Eisenman as either a charlatan, a knave, or a fool. Only David Flusser seems to take him more seriously. You will surely feel, as a Jew, very well in his ideas, he assured me, noting as a caution that I like to say that I cannot accept them, not because I cannot accept them myself, but because reality cannot accept them. The reality to which he was referring was the still overwhelming earthly power of the proponents of Paul's belief. At the time the Qumran community was reaching its greatest size and its greatest influence in Judea, religious messengers were traveling among the bustling cities of the eastern Mediterranean, far from the tumults and conflicts of Jerusalem, with a very different gospel to spread. In contrast to the angry fundamentalism of the leaders of the Judean movement, with its demand for modesty, purity, and poverty, the Jews of the diaspora, in the large cosmopolitan cities of Italy, Greece, and Asia Minor, with their wide circle of Gentile God-fearing supporters, were rarely eager to emphasize the strict purity laws and dietary codes that set them apart from their fellow citizens. And as Paul and his followers traveled to the cities of Ephesus, Corinth, and Philippi, they were offering the teachings of a new cult that appealed to the vast middle body of assimilated Jews and God-fearers. It was a Bible-based cult that was both idealistic and universal, imbued with the passion and rapture of the messianic hope, but stripped of its explicit demand that the earthly empire of Rome be overthrown. Despite the fact that Jesus did not return in the expected short period of time, and nothing changed in the day-to-day world except their new religious identity and continuing expectations, the Christian communities of the Mediterranean began to consider themselves the true Israel. But this Israel would not insist on separating itself completely from the Roman Empire. On the contrary, in less than 300 years, church and empire would be officially joined. Thus, in Judea, for the people fighting to preserve the distinctive laws and purity codes of their nation as protection against outside political and economic encroachment, the preaching of a rival gospel that actually encouraged abandoning the Mosaic law was seen as a mortal threat. The coming of the kingdom of God was dependent on the proper observance of the law by the people of Israel. That was what the Qumran sect was predicated on, the fulfillment of the Torah under the strictest possible criteria. The observance of the law was therefore regarded as central to the continued existence of the people of Israel. And even after the destruction of the temple and the reformation of Jewish ritual by the rabbis, Judaism still bore the messianic hope that perfect observance of the Torah would bring about a far-reaching transformation of the world. Yet for Christians, the rejection of the law became a central tenet of their faith, that a new covenant had been established in which an incarnated, crucified, and resurrected Messiah had atoned for the sins of all. Through this new messianic religion might aspire to the highest ideals of behavior, though this new messianic religion might aspire to the highest ideals of behavior, it was, for the Jews, and for all those who refused to abandon their faith in an as yet unarrived revolutionary leader, the warrior savior, a faith that would all too often preach love and practice hate. At the time of the Emperor Constantine's adoption of Christianity, the deified Caesar Augustus was replaced by the heavenly Christ Jesus as the legitimation for Roman power and imperial expansion. The cross now replaced the emperor's image on the legionary battle standards. And as a result of this, will to world domination, the bully boys and enforcers of both high church and world empire would make the Jews, with their strange ways and stubborn demand for independence, objects of disdain and hatred for centuries to come. "I don't see Jesus at all," Robert Eisenman admitted candidly, when I finally got round to asking him the inevitable, obvious question about the role that a historical personality named Jesus of Nazareth may have played in the creation of a distinctively Christian faith. In recent years, a group of liberal Christian scholars who call themselves the Jesus Seminar have been gathering for meetings at which they vote on the historical reliability of the various recorded sayings of Jesus, giving each a numerical reliability quotient. For Eisenman, however, the New Testament is itself part of the problem, not the source of a solution, statistical or otherwise. "I really don't see him because the material we have about him has been so artificialized and worked over and mythologized and undergone retrospective theological transformation that to get to any human being called Jesus with any sustainability is, as I've said from the beginning, an impossibility, while acknowledging that there may very well have been a personality named Jesus who was somehow involved in the political and religious upheavals in Judea. The Gospels are, to his mind, far too tendentious and theologically motivated to be relied upon as sound historical evidence. Jesus could represent a Throngis for all I know," Eisenman continued, referring to an obscure and quickly squashed messianic pretender mentioned by Josephus Flavius. "Hellenized, Pax Romanticized, turned into the lover of Gentiles, the lover of the Pax Romana, the lover of the Roman Empire, the lover of Roman centurions, the lover of tax collectors, the lover of prostitutes. What can I say about any of that material?" It's all preposterous. It is a measure of how out of touch with reality Robert Eisenman was when he arrived in Jerusalem in the summer of 1985 as the National Endowment for the Humanities Fellow at the Albright Institute of Archaeological Research, that he naively assumed that he would be welcomed into the fraternity of Dead Sea Scroll scholarship. He far underestimated the intensity of religious belief that often lies just beneath the surface of historical and archaeological discussions in Jerusalem. The origins of Christianity and the historicity of Jesus were not issues taken lightly, nor were they apparently suitable subjects for a no-holds-barred historical debate. Tradition has it that every visiting professor or academic fellow at the Albright Institute give a public lecture on his research. Scholars from local universities and other foreign archaeological institutions are invited. It is a coming-out party, an academic audition rolled into one. Eisenman recalls looking forward to the opportunity of presenting his Qumran theories, but he did not now realize that he was about to blow up all the academic bridges that he might ever have been able to build. All the guys from the École were invited, he remembered, too vividly for comfort. Benoit, Puick, Murphy O'Connor, and so on. All these so-called pseudo-experts. And I packed everything into the paper I gave there. I forgot the title. It was the connections or the parallels between Jerusalem community and the community at Qumran, and some of the weakness of the paleography and history and archaeology. Well, they came in as a group and they walked out as a group, totally stone-faced, in total silence. They didn't even come up and say, "Good paper, good try, interesting." They just walked out with totally blank faces, and I think that was the first time they were ever aware that I existed. They never read my work, I don't think. Eisenman also mistakenly assumed that he would be granted free access to the unpublished K4 manuscripts that were relevant to his research. At the time, he still believed that historical scholarship was about the search for the truth, no matter what the implications, and even if his colleagues detested his theories, they had an obligation to facilitate, not hinder, legitimate study and research. But as the weeks and months passed, Eisenman found himself being treated politely by everyone he talked to, but getting no closer to seeing new material than if he had remained at home in Long Beach. The moment I went to the Department of Antiquities, I got the Great Stonewall approach, he told me. "You know, we can't help you. Go to Father Benoit." And at a polite meeting at the École Biblique, at which he gratefully accepted copies of Eisenman's books and off-prints, Father Benoit informed Eisenman that since he was merely editor-in-chief of the publication project, not physical custodian, Eisenman really should go back and apply to the Department of Antiquities. This was all, of course, a search in total darkness, for Eisenman, like all other outsiders, did not have an accurate idea of just how much or what kinds of material was still being held by the team. His awakening was rude and unexpected. After a frustrating visit to the Rockefeller Museum to meet Antiquities Director Ave Atan, and to apply unsuccessfully for the access to the unpublished fragments, he sat dejected in one of the workrooms of the museum, and, as he describes it, an employee of the department simply felt sorry for him. They were just making a friendly gesture, Eisenman remembered. I was just sitting in there, kind of moaning and saying, "I can't see anything. I can't do anything. This guy won't do anything for me." The department worker left for a moment. He returned with full computer printout of all the unpublished Qumran manuscripts. This was one of those low-level bureaucratic actions that sometimes have enormous effects. For as Eisenman scanned the list of hundreds of plates, he saw now only the listings for the biblical books, apocryphal works, and sectarian texts, like the community rule and the Damascus document, but an astonishing wealth of prayers, visions, wisdom literature, and messianic poetry. Only the titles and the inventory numbers were listed. One can only imagine what the text contained. It was enough to make any scroll scholar's mouth water. In Millick's lot alone were not only the famous Qumran copies of the Damascus document, but at least 7 new manuscripts of the community rule, 5 of the Book of Jubilees, calendars, lists of priestly courses, and an intriguing mixture of unknown apocryphal works, biblical commentaries, and texts identified as angelical, astronomical, and cryptogrammic. Even for scholars without a new theory of Qumran origins to propound, this was a treasure. But for Eisenman, it was the key to proving his theories. He was convinced that they contained the clinching evidence of the link between the Jewish revolt, Jewish messianism, and pre-Pauline Christianity. There it was, the authentic literature of the Judean messianic movement. But getting access to the fragments would now become more of a political challenge than a scholarly one. Near the end of the 1985-1986 academic year, as Eisenman and his family were preparing to leave Israel after a year of runarounds and disappointment, something else happened. It was a much mythologized confrontation that Eisenman would later insist was a major turning point in the story of the scrolls. It was a drunken toast made in the middle of the night in the garden terrace of the Albright Institute in Jerusalem, a toast about which Eisenman's and Strugnell's recollections diverge radically. According to Eisenman, he and his wife, Heather, happened to meet Strugnell at a fairly sedate academic party in West Jerusalem, and when it was over, they invited him back to the Albright Institute for a nightcap and further friendly conversation about their mutual interest in the scrolls. Eisenman remembers that I was interested in the international team and what was going on and to hear from his perspective. So for me, it was an entertaining, interesting evening. We were sitting in the Albright garden at 3 o'clock in the morning, and then he made this incredible toast to me. Eisenman continued, I don't think he understood I was Jewish at the time, although at some point he did get the idea. He didn't understand that I was Jewish because of my wife. She had converted to Judaism, and he had been married in Israel, and we had been married in Israel, and we had lived there from 68 to 73. But for him, she was Scottish and British, and very sophisticated and elegant, and he couldn't understand what she was doing with someone like me. So, in the midst of all this, he turns to me, Eisenman went on, because basically his whole intent for the evening was to go and watch the sun rise over Moab. He had this idea in his brain. He wanted to stay up all night and watch the sun rise over Moab, and he wanted basically to get me out of the picture. He wanted to go with Heather. So he said, will you drink to anyone I propose? I was interested because it was such an original toast. I said, sure, make a proposal. I wanted to know who he had in mind. So he lifted his glass and said, Heather is sitting there right next to me, he says. I want to drink to the greatest living man of the latter part of the 20th century. I said, Jesus, this is fantastic. Who could this be? And then we all sat forward on our chairs, listening. And he says, Kurt Waldheim. I almost fell off my chair. This was at the time of the Kurt Waldheim revelations in the Israel press. It was obviously on his mind. He was all probably seething about this. You know, the Israel the Israeli press was probably going on about this stuff as they usually do. So I didn't know what to do at that point because he had just confirmed to me everything that I had thought about his international team and its basic subconscious ethos. Not necessarily its conscious motivation, but its subconscious ethos. And here is the guy that the Israeli government were going to confirm as the head of the Dead Sea Scrolls research team. I didn't want to show that I was upset, and I just drank my cup and put it down. But I really felt that it was an insult, and I wanted to get back. I had to try to think of someone who would upset him as much as he tried to upset me. Now I happen to love Ordy Wingate. He's the Jewish T.E. Lawrence, and I just loved his biblical thing, and he basically set the foundation of the Israeli army and trained all those guys, and he did it on the basis of biblical scripture. So he was a very able commander, and he died tragically in the Kindet campaign in Indochina. And I always thought, let's read that again. Now I happen to love Ordy Wingate. He's the Jewish T.E. Lawrence, and I just loved his biblical thing. And he basically set the foundation of the Israeli army and trained all those guys, and he did it on the basis of biblical scripture. So he was a very able commander, and he died tragically in the Chindet campaign in Indochina. And I always thought that it was a great tragedy because I thought he was killed, frankly, eliminated. He was really hated. So I knew Strugnell, coming from a British private school in London and being a Brit from the Oxford Circle, would know things that the average Qumran researcher wouldn't know. So I said, okay. I drank to whomever you asked. Now you drink to whomever I ask. Well, that's gentlemanly, of course, and he said sure. So I said, I want to drink to Ord Wingate. He blew up. He blew up. He wouldn't drink. He smashed his glass down on the table and said, and this guy was lucid. He said, I won't drink to that traitor. He knew who I was talking about. He knew what it meant. This is how he kept his gentlemanly bargain. That was it for me. That was it. No quarter after that. Because nobody could call Ord Wingate a traitor as far as I'm concerned. What did that mean? You see, to me, spiritually, what did that mean? That meant that someone who liked Jews, he was a traitor. And someone who did the kinds of things that Waldheim did, he was a great hero. That was it for me. I had it after that. There was nothing that I wouldn't do, and there was no end that I wouldn't go to dislodge these people from control of the most precious documents of Jewish history. The famous toast in the garden of the Albright Institute certainly makes for a dramatic story, but it is only fair to give Strugnell's version as well. That meeting took place, Strugnell admitted to me, but as he is incapable of summarizing any book of the New Testament, so he shows the same skill in my after-dinner talk, you know. Some of the topics, indeed, were mentioned, but he got it completely wrong, what I was trying to say. I don't remember the party, but the meeting in the garden, yes, Strugnell continued. Everyone remembers certain things. I remember some of the topics, not others. The discussion about Waldheim was about whether one state has the right to interfere with the democratic process of another. It seemed at the time it was not the business of other countries, and here Strugnell was clearly referring to Israel. This is the claim I make also about American foreign policy. So at the time, all I knew was that Waldheim had not been one of the worst Secretary Generals of the UN. My main point was about the role of foreign countries. I don't often give toast, Strugnall insisted, and Wingate, to me, is just an overgrown Boy Scout. I would never use the language of traitor to king and country. That's not my style. I happen to have a trick on the rare occasions, when I do have to give a toast, to use the famous toast of the Duke of Dorset, where you toast. Strugnall paused as he tried to remember the words. You see how rarely I do this. I toast to church and state, sovereign, and to the ladies. It's a famous toast. This toast I cannot remember at all. All I can say is that since he's inviting me to give a toast, then my contempt for Wingate is authentic, and I can't believe that he would hoax the story. But the thing that no one seems to have noticed is that he presents himself as pandering his wife to me in order to get a chance of editing the scrolls. This is a most ungentlemanly attitude. Has he not noticed that? I think he's given the framework of certain elements of the story, Strugnall concluded, but I think I hold my liquor better than he does, and I think he may be confused. Confused or not, Eisenman stood embarked on a campaign that was aimed at nothing less than the destruction of the international team. And looking back on the subsequent attempts to break through the iron grip of the establishment on Qumran studies, you certainly have to admire his sheer doggedness. John Allegro is the only previous dissident in the history of the project who ever came close to fomenting a public uproar as potent as Eisenman's, and Allegro died a discredited eccentric, an outsider in every sense of the word. Indeed, most of the scholars who had ever challenged the traditional interpretations of the text, or the international team's methods of work, wisely learned from the experience of banging their heads against the stone walls of the Rockefeller Museum. And most of them eventually, and prudently, shifted their attention to scholarly issues that were not quite so sensitive. But Robert Eisenman banged his head on those same walls, and he kept on banging, even though Megan Brochy of the Shrine of the Book reportedly told him half fastidiously that he would never see many of the unpublished texts in his lifetime. That might have been the definitive brush-off, but Eisenman was more determined than most. For him, the issue of the Dead Sea Scrolls gradually melded into larger issues of Jewish pride and nationalism, and resentment of the great powers who controlled, even now, the precious literary legacy of first-century Judean Messianism. He believed that the real historical context of the birth of Christianity was being suppressed. His rage against empires, intellectual, political, and religious, drove him on. He was also more politically savvy than most scholars. He gained support for his campaign for Dr. Yuval Nehaman, a member of Knesset and one of the most outspoken leaders of the Israeli radical right. You can call him Dr. Strangelove, Eisenman told me, anticipating a negative reaction, and I'm not necessarily interested in his political views. But Neham, a theoretical physicist turned politician, was ready to run with the ball. Nehaman had been Minister of Science and Development in the Begin government, but had eventually left the ruling coalition to become an opposition spokesman on the extreme right. He was fascinated with the stories that Eisenman told him about the failure of the Israeli government to take rightful control of this precious national treasure, of the continuing power of a less than sympathetic international committee, and of the team's restriction on free scholarship. He could embarrass the government, Eisenman remembered. So he did. The demand for immediate Israeli control of the Dead Sea Scrolls eventually became the subject of brief, bombastic Knesset hearings, and because the Likud government did not like to be described as incompetent or submissive in their dealings with foreigners, political pressure was soon applied through the Ministry of Education on the Department of Antiquities. In 1988, a new director had just been appointed for the traditionally sleepy department, General Amir Drori, a retired career army officer who had been a senior commander of Israeli forces in Lebanon. Drori took charge of Israelis' antiquities with a vengeance, reorganizing the structure and goals of the organization, determined to transform it into a powerful, self-supporting antiquities authority. Regarding the Dead Sea Scrolls, he received a clear ruling from government lawyers that according to international law, the Israeli Department of Antiquities had authority to assume full control over the preservation and publication of the manuscripts. The ownership chain for the K4 collection was, to say the least, convoluted. It was first purchased by the Palestine Archaeological Museum, which was then partially reimbursed by the government of Jordan, which was then substantially aided by the sale of allotments of scrolls to foreign installations, which were then cancelled when the museum was finally nationalized in 1966. Then came the war in 1967. In such a situation, a clear-cut interpretation of the legal situation was as subjective as the historical interpretation of some of the scrolls. But with the go-ahead for action, Drori instituted a clear policy change. From now on, the Israeli Department of Antiquities would reserve to itself the right to oversee and approve all major administrative actions of the international team. In the fall of 1988, Eisenman, like many other foreign scholars working in Israel, thought it wise for future good relations to make a get-acquainted appointment with Drori, to go to his office at the Rockefeller Museum and pay his respects. That office, which is paneled wooden door, stone walls, and incongruous little fireplace, had been the locus of archaeological power in the country for more than half a century, from the time of Gerald Lancaster Harding to Abdel Karim al-Garayaba to Anwar Dajani, Avraham Biran, and Avi Atan. Its occupants had played central roles by their action or inaction in determining the fate of the scrolls. That is why Eisenman was so intent on the meeting. Since he had heard of the change of policy regarding the scrolls, Eisenman wanted to go on record to urge Drori to fire Strugnell immediately and abolish the monopoly of the international team. I told them the whole thing about the scrolls was about Strugnell, Eisenman said, recalling that first meeting with Drori in the director's office in the Rockefeller Museum. And then he told me, "That's interesting, what you say, because we're just in the process of going to sign a contract with Strugnell for editing of the scrolls." I said, "What?" This was the total opposite of everything I had been working with Neheman to achieve. They were not only going to reconfirm these guys in power, but give them absolute control and license through the contract. I said this is the absolute opposite of everything I had worked for. I said, "You can't do this. This is ridiculous." And then I told him the story of the Waldheim thing, and it made no impression on him whatsoever. He said, "Uh-huh, Yeah, okay. What do I care? Now I have to say this. Now I have to say that Amir Drury is not what you would describe as a bubbly personality. He embodies his husky frame, short cropped gray hair, deep voice, and slow deliberate way of speaking, the indelible stamp of his years of military service, years of overseeing the operational planning of Israeli forces, years of regimenting officers and soldiers to look to objectives larger than their individual uncertainties and pain. And thus it was that the Dead Sea Scrolls came to be for him a logistical rather than an emotional matter. Even today, Amir Drury's maintains that the private political or religious orientation of scroll scholars is of no interest to the Israeli Antiquities Authority in the fulfillment of its responsibility to bring the scrolls publication project to a successful conclusion. I know that some of the people who decide about the material are not exactly great Zionists, he told me. But I don't judge them by their Zionism, only by their ability to publish the text. I don't check anyone to see if they are a priest or an anti-Semite. My only question is whether he can publish and will publish. Those are the only criteria. But for Eisenman, who considered the scrolls to be precious historical evidence that was being suppressed, misinterpreted, neutered, or delayed precisely because of the scholar's religious orientation, Drury and the Antiquities Authority were part of the problem, not the solution. And while Larry Schiffman and others were working quietly on the inside to coax out new material little by little, Eisenman decided that desperate times required desperate measures. He decided that he had to do whatever he could to break up what he saw as collusion between the Antiquities Authority and the international team. In March 1989, Eisenman joined Professor Philip Davies of Sheffield University in England in making a formal request to John Strugnell that they be granted permission to examine, for the purposes of their private research, the text whose great historical importance Millick had enthusiastically announced more than 30 years before, but which had remained unpublished and inaccessible. We, and many others, Eisenman and Davies wrote, feel that 35 to 40 years is enough time to wait for these materials to become generally available on a scientific basis to the scholarly community. They sent a similar letter to Amir Drury and requested that both Drury and Strugnell respond to this formal request within 30 days. Strugnell claims that he knew very well what Eisenman was up to. From the tone of the letter, which had, in the meantime, been leaked to the press in Israel and in America, Strugnell naturally assumed that it was not meant to get manuscripts, but to set the foundation for the legal battle. Yet in the reply to Eisenman and Davies, Strugnell did not seem to grasp how dangerous an opponent he had. He acted as if he were dealing with some impertinent working-class lad who had barged into Jesus College at Oxford and banged on the door of the master's rooms. As a rule, I do not write answers to public letters, Strugnell admonished. I make just the one exception in your case, hoping that it will inspire you in any further letters to follow politer and more acceptable norms. The normal procedure, he informed them, was to write directly to the assigned editor. That has been the way that such requests for access have been handled in the past. The truth was, proper procedure or not, no outsider had ever been given access unless the specific editor wanted to grant it. The editor-in-chief had never intervened because there was no possibility of appeal. Yet at the same time, Strugnell recognized that there was a problem. Under the mounting behind-the-scenes pressure of the Antiquities Authority, he persuaded Millick to unload two important groups of material to other scholars: the several manuscripts of the Book of Jubilees, the Jubilee type compositions to James Vander Kam, then of North Carolina State University, and the much sought-after manuscripts of the Damascus document to Joseph Baumgarten of the Baltimore Hebrew University. When Eisenman learned of these reassignments several months later, he was livid. The power of the international team remained unbroken despite all he had done. Both of Strugnell's designees were dependable, conventional scholars. Vanderkam was a student of Cross, who had worked extensively in the Enoch and Jubilee literature that would certainly produce competent editions of those texts. The choice of Baumgarten for the Damascus document, though, was more pointed. With his younger colleague Larry Schiffman, Baumgarten had emerged as a leader of the halakhic approach to the Qumran material, seeing the legal discussions of the sect as a unique and characteristically Judean style of religious expression that would find its fullest expression in the legal debates of later Rabbinic Judaism. Eisenman was constructing quite a different historical picture, in which Rabbinic Judaism, like Christianity, was a distinctive variation of the biblical religion that had survived primarily because of the adherents' eventual accommodation with Rome. Neither Schiffman nor Baumgarten had ever taken Eisenman very seriously. Back in 1977, Eisenman had given his first paper, James the Just as Righteous Teacher, at a meeting of the Society of Biblical Literature. Schiffman saw me for the first time, Eisenman remembered, and burst out laughing at my paper, which startled me and really amazed me and offended me. Eventually, Eisenman's colleague Philip Davies wrote to Baumgarten directly asking him for access to the Damascus document fragments. But he merely received a polite refusal, with Baumgarten replying that there was really nothing dramatically new in the historical sections of the document, and as for the many new laws it included, which you and other writers have not treated, he was working as hard as he could to place them in some perspective from the viewpoint of halakha. That was exactly the point. Baumgarten would not put those laws into just any perspective, because the task of editor and interpreter had become so intertwined. The first editions of the Qumran text were not simple transcriptions, as the publications of the Cave 1 scrolls had been. Each one was meant to be an extensive excursus, not only presenting the letter's words and columns transcribed from the joined fragments, but also placing the text somewhere in the historical narrative that the editor considered to be the correct one. Thus, some scholars, primarily interested in the early history of Christianity, would interpret their text as Essene documents, naturally seeing hidden allusions and obscured references as background material for the study of New Testament. Other scholars, coming from a rabbinic perspective, would interpret their text as evidence for the kind of halakhic debates that would eventually become the basis of Rabbinic Judaism. Yet Eisenman was convinced that the Dead Sea Scrolls offered unique evidence for a radical rewriting of the origins of both Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity, even though most scrolls scholars would not or could not recognize that fact. From the rabbinic types, you were getting pilpul and legal hair splitting, Eisenman told me. And from the Christian side, you were getting total blindness as far as history and textual material went, and no critical view of Christianity at all. The irony, to his mind, was that the rabbinic scholars generally lack of familiarity with the New Testament left the standard picture of Qumran and early Christianity largely unchallenged. It also left intact the gospel image that Jesus was rejected and handed over for the execution by the Jews. Jesus and his followers were a part of the national movement. It was Paul's rejection, not Jesus, that led to the creation of an entirely new cult. I explained all this to Schiffman, Eisenman remembered, but he could never understand it. By destroying me, you're actually confirming the Christian accusations against the Jewish people, and you're not allowing our people to get out from under the terrible blood libels that have been extant for 1900 years. The only answer now was complete liberation. No more halfway measures, no more teams. The only answer was to make the photographs immediately available to the scholars, and according to Eisenman, let 1,000 voices sing. The chorus might not exactly be the Vienna Boys Choir, but wasn't that exactly the point of academic freedom? Eisenman was eager for his story to get as wide coverage as possible. Thus the battle was joined in the spring of 1989. Eisenman's unsuccessful struggle to get access to unpublished material was first covered in the pages of the Biblical Archaeology Review, and eventually in the mainstream American news media. The battle for the scrolls moved from the halls of the Rockefeller Museum to the American world of investigative journalism, People magazine, and CNN. After years of complete silence on the Dead Sea Scrolls, newspapers, magazine, and TV networks soon jumped on the story. There was now in America a whole generation of well-educated baby boomers turned middle-agers who had grown up seeing their news and learning about their world through the narrative grammar of television, where talking heads became metaphors, not people, where any angry Colonel Oliver North sitting gun-stock straight at a congressional hearing became a symbol, not just an individual. The Dead Sea Scrolls story had its share of good characters. A maverick scholar from Southern California, the colorful NYU professor, an imperious Oxford-educated Harvard professor, a strong-jawed Israeli general, and hints of a shadowy ecclesiastical conspiracy. The story was soon to be hijacked and restructured through the collective mind's eye of 60 Minutes style embarrassing close-ups and hidden cameras. A classic battle was portrayed of the forces of intellectual freedom against the forces of repression, with an exotic Middle Eastern locale thrown in. The battle lines between Sons of Light and Sons of Darkness were forming, but the irony was that everyone, Larry Schiffman, Robert Eisenman, John Strugnell, and Emir Drury, were all convinced that they were the Sons of Light. Yet for the Dead Sea Scrolls story to be anything more than a passing sensation, and for the Scrolls' monopoly to be broken, Eisenman and his occasional allies could not continue to act as individuals. And it was Herschel Shanks of the Biblical Archaeology Review who would soon begin to organize their separate efforts into a powerful international campaign.